Hi, everyone. Welcome back. So we're going to cover Chapter 6, which is Behaviorism on learning aspects of personality. So we're going to focus a lot on the work of B.F. Skinner and Pavlov. So lots of learning and classical conditioning and how that shapes aspects of personality. This chapter doesn't shy away from pointing out competing views of utopia and of human free will. During the 17th century, there was a philosopher known as John Locke, and he was called the father of enlightenment, but he was also the founder of empirical psychology, and he studied children. And he considered children miniature adults, and that children are strangers to the world, and they are curious, and anything is at first unknown to them, as it once was to us as an adult. So they are naturally curious and they learn to experience the world and learn from the world. And so he believed that all minds are like blank slates. And so personality is formed from life experiences. We don't have this innate ability or innate type of personality trait. And so that was his ultimate belief, is that the mind is a blank slate upon which anything can be imprinted. He was very optimistic about this transformative power of education and that experiences of life are what cause our behavior. And they're learned through that experience. And so unlike Freud, he specified and emphasized this great influence of the situation on our behavior. So Pavlov was a Russian physiologist, and he laid the groundwork for learning approaches. And so he was a behaviorist, and he discovered the important principle called classical conditioning. So he studied digestion in dogs and their behaviors. And he found that food, which is an unconditioned stimulus, caused salivation in dogs. The salivation is an unconditioned or automatic response to food. He found that this occurred at the same time pairing it with something that normally doesn't cause salivation, such as a bell. Now, the bell is a neutral stimulus, and so pairing the food presentation with a bell a number of times actually caused the dogs to salivate when they heard the bell. And so this is what's called the conditioned stimulus. The bell is a conditioned stimulus, and it comes to elicit a conditioned response, which is the salivation. And so similarly, people can be conditioned to salivate in response to the sound of a food chime on a ranch. Pavlov also observed generalization, discrimination, and extinction. And so the conditioned response would occur in response to stimuli that were similar to the conditioned stimulus. So this is generalization of the conditioning. However, the conditioned response would not occur for all possible similar stimuli. So this indicated the animal could also learn to tell a difference between different stimuli and similar ones. So this is known as discrimination. So for example, if the food followed a bell of only one tone, but it did not follow the ringing of a bell of other tones, the dog would discriminate this one tone, and the conditioned response would occur only in response to that particular tone. For a young boy that is stung by bees and bitten by mosquitoes, they might become fearful of the buzzing of all insects, which would be generalization. Now, in terms of extinction, this is sort of like unlearning a conditioned response. And all of these do play a role in personality development. Many behavioral reaction patterns are explained by conditioning. So neutral stimuli associated with positive, enjoyable occurrences can become likes, but events or consequences associated with negative responses become dislikes. So for example, a college student can learn to associate drinking at parties with having a pleasant sociable time with friends, but a woman that gets raped at a party might develop a personality that fears college social events involving any kind of alcohol. And so based on Pavlov's observations, this provides a basis for explaining these emotional aspects of personality and why some people have fears while others do not. So the extinction process occurs when you stop pairing the conditioned and unconditioned stimulus together. So extinction is when the conditioned response starts to become less frequent. And so it's kind of like unlearning your conditioned response. So the association gets weaker over time until it just disappears. So, in other words, personality, which is the pattern of response, changes. For example, somebody that got raped at a party who developed a fearful personality, so they got afraid of going to parties, could undergo a dramatic personality change if they repeatedly experience these events. So they repeatedly exposed themselves to the event and they realize that this time it's a different outcome. They don't get raped. So if they go with a supportive friend, they start to associate that supportive friend with positive outcomes of going to a party. Unfortunately, people that have learned to fear certain things will often avoid them. And so, therefore, they're not allowing their fear to extinguish. And so, this tends to happen a lot with people that have a generalized anxiety disorder or OCD, where there's obsessive thoughts or fears in certain situations. And so, rather than exposing yourself to that situation, you avoid that situation. So, this is where the extinction process would not happen. And so in order for extinction to happen, you have to expose yourself to that situation and pair it with a different type of stimulus, which means you would stop pairing the conditioned and unconditioned stimulus together. Pavlov also explained that neuroticism may be a conditioned response and fostered by a specific environment. So Pavlov was able to condition a response similar to neurotic behavior in a dog. So first he associated food presentation with a circle, but not with an ellipse, and the dog developed a conditioned response to the circle, discriminating it from the ellipse. So then Pavlov gradually increased the roundness of the ellipse, so it approximated the circle. And when the dog could no longer discriminate the circle from the ellipse, it began to exhibit neurotic behavior, which hints that neuroticism can be learned and fostered by the environment that requires an individual to discriminate between two events under certain conditions, and typically in conditions where judgment is not possible. For example, some children find it impossible to predict the reactions of their unstable parents. And so if children are not sure whether to expect praise or punishment, and they sort of have a hard time discriminating the two, they may feel frustrated, anxious, and even depressed. And so classical conditioning is a powerful explanation of response patterns, and it shows in a lot of the research evidence that having a strong natural pairing of a stimulus and automatic response promotes behavior and personality changes. So one of the major weaknesses with conditioning principles is that it's assumed to be a general rule that applies uniformly to all animals, all species. But after, a lot of literature and research, we now know that different organisms are more easily conditioned to respond in certain ways than others. So hungry dogs can be conditioned to salivate with a bell that is paired with the sight and smell of meat. But every species and every individual has certain tendencies that facilitate or can impair certain learning. So humans rely more on visual cues and smells, and different people have different perceptual and aesthetic inclinations. And so knowing this sort of allows for individual differences to still play a role in learning. And so again, it's this nature versus nurture argument. But classical conditioning does remain a powerful explanation of these response patterns, and much of our learned patterns of responses come from experience or anticipating consequences of our actions. So around the beginning of the 20th century, there were some experimental psychologists that were studying psychology using subjective analyses of the human mind. So they would ask people to introspect about their thoughts in order to figure out their unconscious process. And this approach was fraught with a lot of methodological difficulties, and so there was really no way of validating or confirming the data and conclusions, because they couldn't possibly know if what people reported thinking was really an accurate representation of their minds. So because introspection had a lack of research evidence, because there was difficulties with the methods and design, and there's really no way to prove introspection and what people are actually thinking is a generalization of their psyche. The key learning approach in psychology was founded by John Watson, known as behaviorism. And so Watson wanted to develop a rigorous science that completely rejected introspection. And according to him, the thoughts and feelings elicited through introspection are unobservable and unscientific. His theories about studying observable behavior and disregarding introspection were laid out in his book called Behavior. And he wrote an important book about behaviorism called Psychology from the Standpoint of a Behaviorist. And so both he and Rosalie Rayner, they condemned the introspectionists that were studying consciousness and psychoanalysis. So they rejected this idea that there is an unconscious mind because it can't be proven, and there's no research evidence to indicate that there is an unconscious. So through generalization, there was another study conducted by Watson, the famous one, the Little Albert study. He demonstrated the manner in which emotional responses can be conditioned when applying Pavlov's theory. And so they conditioned little Albert to fear a rat by pairing a very sudden loud noise with the sight of a rat in order to startle little Albert. So every time the rat was presented, they would repeatedly make a sudden loud noise to startle him, and when he reached for the rat, he would also be startled with the noise. And so soon after, the mere sight of the rat would make him cry and fear the rat. And so over time, even generalization was demonstrated, where little Albert's conditioned fear generalized to other furry objects or objects and stimuli that were very similar to the rat. And so this famous study suggested that an emotional response that was conditioned to one stimulus could result in a later emotional reaction to a variety of similar events or stimuli. And so a neutral stimulus might end up eliciting an emotion. So Watson believed that this was how most of personality is formed. And so they also demonstrated systematic desensitization. So if they could condition fear, they could also try to take it away or have the person unlearn a feared response. And so their approach was used in the counter condition, the fear of rats, rabbit fur, feathers, and similar, in a little boy called Peter. And so Peter would play with 3 other children while a fear-inducing rabbit was there. The fear was gradually extinguished by slowly bringing the rabbit closer and closer to the child while keeping him happy. And so over time, Peter became desensitized to the rabbit. And so this aspect of his personality changed because he started to fear the rabbit less and less. This is like a form of exposure. And so and also is a common and successful form of therapy for people that do have anxiety disorders. So because Watson's study showed that highly emotional aspects of personality can appear and disappear, and in the studies they were manipulated through systematic desensitization, there was now this belief that it could be applied to other types of aspects of life, not only emotions, but in other types of ways. So, for example, in people's careers, um, people can be reinforced based on the environment they are in. And so Watson really took seriously the idea that every person was born a blank slate. Um, and so talents, color, inclinations, or career goals, all of these things could be reinforced. Um, and so Watson is proclaiming much more than a specific theory about personality. What he's saying is the environment and life experiences are the key to understanding a person. And so, in other aspects, not just in emotional responses, but even just if people are raised a certain way, they will behave a certain way. If children are raised properly, they will behave properly. If they are raised poorly, they will behave poorly. And so personalities are a function of the environment. And so this perspective is it contrasts with other perspectives. And so this sort of laid the basis for the work of B.F. Skinner, which he was all about reinforcement and believed that personality was controlled by environmental events. So B.F. Skinner believed there's two factors responsible for behavior. One is the environmental event, and then two is the consequences of behavior. He was influenced by Edward Thorndike. Edward came up with a law of effect. And so this argues that the consequences of behavior will either strengthen or weaken that behavior. And so learning comes from trial and error. So we learn to do things that bring us reward, and we learn not to do things that cause us pain. And so this is based on operant conditioning, that our behavior is changed by the consequences. And so shaping successive approximations to desired behavior is the goal. Skinner rejected personality, traits, self-actualization, needs, and instincts, and believed that the basis of everything is reinforcement, and everything we do is through experience and trial and error. That there is no such thing as this innate personality trait. Rather, personality really means behavior, and personality really means life experiences and being shaped by the consequences of the environment. So B.F. Skinner was an American psychologist known for his impact on behaviorism. He was the most influential psychologist of the 20th century because he was well known for operant conditioning, which is his theory of learning. So he proposed that environmental events are consequences of behavior and are responsible for most behavior. And so personality is merely just a group of responses to the environment. And so a lot of his studies involved animal research and decision making. And he studied rats and pigeons, and he observed how pigeons chose a door to obtain a prize. So pigeons would make a choice to open the door, and then after a choice is made, one of the doors open, but doesn't have a prize. So eventually, after putting these pigeons through a number of situations, a number of times, they eventually learned to switch to another door that had a prize. And so this supported his developed principle called operant conditioning, which assumes that behavior can be changed and controlled through consequences and rewards. So the fact that animals were able to be trained and learn through positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement meant that behavior is the result of experience with the environment and not personality. And so he did not believe in internal components of personality or this internal psychical structure. A person is merely a function of the environment, and the person's continued behavior is from reinforcement strengthening the performance of that behavior. Skinner also invented the Skinner box, which was a term used to describe an operant chamber for an animal that was segregated from all environmental influences or distractions except those controlled by the experimenter. So the box had a lever or key that pigeons would use to press down, and it would either trigger the release of a food pellet or deliver a shock. So the release of food was a source of positive reinforcement, and shock was a negative reinforcer. He found that pigeons' behaviors were most successfully shaped and taught when rewards were delivered intermittently, which meant that rewards were delivered based on this partial reinforcement schedule in which pigeons demonstrated a mastery of skill, and then they would get the reward. And so in our world, an example of this would be getting a raise or a commission when we make a sale. Skinner wrote a utopia novel known as Walden 2, and it's controversial because in the book it rejects this notion of free will. It proposes that the behavior of organisms is determined by the environment, and the community engineers our behavior. And so systematically altering the environment can create this sociocultural system that closely resembles a utopia. So by Skinner implying that the environment is controlling our behavior doesn't necessarily mean that there are no genetic differences. He did not deny that there are genetic differences or individual differences among organisms. Instead, he said that the role of biological factors was to define an organism's range of responses and the organism's ability to have behavior strengthened by environmental events. And so he believed that these genetic differences are playing a role in how quickly somebody responds to something, or how some people have greater tendencies to learn things better than others, or these range of responses that people seem to have. But the environment is still of primary importance, even in hereditary characteristics, because the environment is selecting behaviors that are encouraging procreation and survival. So ascribing any behavior to an instinct is not accurate because it's ignoring the role of these environmental circumstances. So Skinner did address, thoughts, emotions, and mechanisms, and he believed they do exist, but they are not relevant in explaining and understanding people's behavior. And so thoughts and emotions are occurring, but they're not causing the behavior. They're merely characteristics of the organism that are caused by situations. They're caused by environmental events. And so internal processes that are going on is not explaining behavior. So for example, if somebody feels tired or appears to be tired, he claims to look to the environment, meaning, well, she must be tired because maybe she didn't sleep enough, or depending on how much she slept, and so on and so forth, which is based on an environmental event, not a thought or an emotion. And so contrary to what a lot of personality theorists have emphasized, personality is not something that is uniquely human and is really just a group of behaviors that have been well supported by environmental events. And so the similarities between Freud and Skinner are that they were both radical determinists, and they believe that there is no free will in people's behavior. In Skinner, it's the environment controlling behavior. And in Freud, it's our behavior is controlled by our internal psychic structure. And so therefore, we have no free will in the matter, and any organism could potentially have a personality, if that's how you want to define it. Other experimental psychologists had other learning approaches to personality, and so a lot of them also believe that behavior was not a total function of environmental events, but rather behavior was also determined by the combination of events and the organism's internal features. And so organisms have these internal characteristics that are drives, such as hunger and tiredness. And this was based on Clark's Hole's research and emphasis. And so his emphasis was on experimentation and this organized theory of learning and the nature of habits. And habits are simply associations we make between a stimulus and then our response to it. So the organism, like a white rat, makes responses that lead to a goal that alleviates a drive. And so the responses in themselves become stimuli for further responses and intervene between the stimulus and response. And so he believed that all our behavior is determined by these primary drives: hunger, thirst, sex, and the avoidance of pain. So we learn as adults that money and success can lead to a drive reduction. So we make money in order to access food. We make money to alleviate financial issues. We go to the doctor to avoid pain. So when we're in pain, we seek out health services. And so it's important to understand the Clark Hull learning approaches to personality, because he turned attention to this internal state of the organism during learning. But he still also emphasized the reinforcements that are provided by the environment. And so it's this sort of this environmental internal interaction. So the social learning theory came from a very productive and influential group of investigators from various backgrounds. So this came from Miller's research, which focused on environmental reinforcements in laboratory rats, and the focus on internal drives in terms of physiology and motivations. And Dollard's and Miller's study of personality, they looked at psychoanalytic and ego aspects, social and anthropological aspects, and biological and cognitive aspects. And so this helped understand the social learning theory, which proposes that our likelihood of responding in certain ways, which are habits, are built in terms of a hierarchy of secondary or acquired drives. So this anxiety, let's say you learn, is based on this acquired drive that motivates our new behavior. Let's say you are mugged and beaten up while walking down a dark alley, and so you're going to most likely learn to avoid the situation, but you're also going to feel the anxiety in similar situations as that one. So every time you're in a dark alley, you're going to experience anxiety and fear. And so the anxiety is now the acquired drive. You could be reinforced when this drive is reduced, such as always walking at night with a confident companion. You might even learn to enjoy sipping wine with a good-humored group of friends when the sun begins to set. So the lighthearted companions will not protect you from being mugged on the dark alley, but it's this hierarchy of responses which have been built up now from this learning and reducing of new drives. Social learning theory posits that our habits are built up in terms of a hierarchy of acquired secondary drives, known as a habit hierarchy. A habit hierarchy is a learned hierarchy of likelihoods that a person will produce particular responses in particular situations. And so we have primary drives. When we're a child, through the infant stage, we have hunger, we have avoidance of pain, thirst, and comfort. And so those are our primary physiological drives. The concept of secondary drives explains our development of more complex motivations we have. And these are love, power, and traditional personality constructs, like the trait of extroversion. And so there's primary drives, but then there's also evidence for secondary drives. And secondary drives are based on what we learn through social reward and reinforcement. So over time, we become socialized by our culture, by people around us, by the environment. We learn how to love. We learn whether to be individualistic or collectivistic. And so this sort of explains the differences in cultures, why some cultures like Japan, which promotes group cohesion, have more shy people than other cultures that are more individualistic and reward individualism and assertiveness. And so children are socialized and gain these secondary drives. They learn them through social rewards. And so this theory was actually extended by Harlow. And so the notion of secondary drives is derived from the primary drive of feeding, which was applied to the concept of attachment to the mother and examined by Harlow's famous study. So he took some infant monkeys, he separated them from their mothers, and some of the infants were fed by feeding bottles attached to a bare wire cylinder. And then other infants were fed by soft, terry cloth covered surrogate mothers. And he found that infant monkeys did not develop a secondary drive of attachment to these wired surrogate mothers, even when they were being fed. And so attachment wasn't derived from its association with nourishment. And it suggested that contact comfort itself has a primary drive status. And so this suggested that a developing child needs more than to have primary needs satisfied. They also have to have secondary needs satisfied. Primary drives are not enough to explain evidence for monkeys being more attached to soft terry cloth covered surrogate mothers despite the fact that they weren't being fed by these mothers. And so not only do we require primary needs, but we also do have secondary needs as well. Not only did such studies suggest, the developing child needs more than primary needs, but they also showed the difficulty of simply accounting for social needs and tendencies using only concepts like primary drives. Dollard and Miller attempted to explain the development of mental illnesses and repressed conflicts. So there are conflicts between primary and secondary drives that can result in neuroticism and mental illness. So there's 3 conflicts. One is approach avoidance, which is being drawn both to and away from something. So for example, children have primary drives, but sometimes they're punished for acting on them. If the punishment results in this conditioning of a fear response to this drive, the primary and secondary drives may conflict in an approach avoidance conflict. So the individual is both drawn to and away from the object, resulting in anxious, neurotic behavior. Approach is being drawn simultaneously to 2 equally attractive choices. And then avoidance is being confronted with 2 equally unattractive choices. And so with avoidance, the individual is repulsed by 2 undesirable choices. So this can make a rat, for example, run back and forth in a maze, not knowing what drive to reduce first, which would result in a neurotic rat. Searle tested the efficacy of Dollard and Miller's theoretical explanations for personality. And so he looked at patterns of child rearing and personality. And he described it as potentialities for action that included motivation, expectations, habit structure, the nature of the instigators to behavior, and the environmental events produced by that behavior. And so he was interested in looking at child rearing patterns of dependency and aggressiveness in children. Childhood personality was measured by teachers' ratings, behavioral observation, and doll play. And then he looked at child rearing practices which were obtained by a maternal report. And overall, his study found that many child rearing practices were weakly or not at all related to personality characteristics in children. He found that a lot of it was about whether children were punished for undesirable behavior. So for example, he found that the amount that the parent reported punishing the child for dependency was highly related to both dependency and aggression in the child. Modern behaviorist personality approaches include behavioral theories, so the reinforcement sensitivity theory, which posits that underlying biobehavioral systems influence individual responsivity to both reward and punishment. The behavioral activation or approach system and behavioral inhibition system moderate the effects of reward and punishment, and they have clear correlations with reliably measured personality traits. There's also the act frequency approach, which connects personality to behaviorism. It looks at frequency with which people perform observable acts, and it records and counts behaviors typical of a given trait category. So behaviorism has really forced the field of personality to be much more rigorous and scientifically sound than it ever was before. So now there are these notions of conditioning, reward, and extinction, which now pervade personality psychology, including clinical psychology. And so behaviorist approaches are now much more rigorous in concepts when it comes to teaching us about personality and why there are personality differences. This approach does provide a more empirically well-supported explanation of why behavior is not as consistent across situations as we once thought it was. And it also implies that the situation itself has to be considered an aspect of personality. And so as a result, we now know a lot more about personality through behaviorism. But there are some limitations. So radical behaviorism is limited by its refusal to take internal mental structures and functions into account. And so you leave a lot of the aspects out now, such as internal structures, cognitions, motives, personality traits, and true heroism. So behaviorists as a whole, they really are not at all concerned with phenomena that isn't observable or quantifiable. So if it doesn't fit into an experimental design, it is often ignored. And so now personality has evolved to where it's a lot more dealing with these behavioristic views, such as conditioning, reward, and reinforcement, and learning distinctions between people's behaviors.